you said.
Cool, thank you. Hi everyone. I'm just going to go because I'm short on time. In the conclusion to his 2012 book, Esotericism and the Academy, Wouter Hanegraaff cites Francis Yates' description of the religion of Hermetic literature as a religion of the world. For Yates and for Hanegraaff, the Hermetic literatures and the esoteric traditions that sprang up from them in the Renaissance and the early modern period described a divinity that was present in and perhaps even synonymous with the material cosmos. It was a cosmology, quote, based upon the fundamental assumption that the divine is at home in the world. This eminent religious posture was not easily superimposed onto the dominant monotheisms of the time, in which a lone transcendent God creates a world ex nihilo. Indeed, as Hanegraaff argues, the intractable tension between these two religious worldviews has been the origin of the entire cultural phenomenon that scholars would later call Western esotericism. I suggest that the emergence of what we now call Western esotericism was made possible by a deep structure of conflict between the dynamics of these two mutually exclusive systems and all that they imply. In short, the logical incompatibility of monotheism and cosmotheism has led to an endless series of creative attempts to resolve it. The meaning of this phrase, religion of the world, it seems, could be the subject of continued serious consideration and scrutiny by scholars of esotericism. More specifically, and in terms relevant to the theme of this conference, one question we might ask of this religion of the world is the meaning of the term revelation. Following Yates and Hanegraaff, in this paper I want to ask the following question. For a religion of the world, for a cosmotheism or a pantheism, what is revealed? Put another way, if divinity is not only coexistent and coterminous, but perhaps simply synonymous with the world, a revelation of what? I'm going to suggest today that revelations of the world take place in the body being that juncture or entanglement zone where boundaries between self and world, subject and object seem to blur. The argument that I'm making today does not need to extend to all manner of revelations. Rather, I am most interested in a subset of these experiences, the sort which refer in some way to the world or the environment of the experiencer. Perhaps foolishly attending to a topic too vast for a conference paper, I want to look at revelations of the world specifically, a category typically referred to as something like nature mysticism, a label which I will reject for reasons made clear later. In so doing, I hope to better understand the ways in which revelation takes place in the world that Hanegraaff and Yates see in the Hermetic literature, and the place it takes is the body. Pointing out the fact that religious experiences have historically been associated with a wild or otherwise unstructured setting is a bit like saying that they're likely to take place on one of 7 days of the week. So strong is the generalized association between the two that it is almost the contextual water in which our very idea of revelation swims. The hierophanies of Yahweh in the wilderness of Exodus, the transfiguration of Jesus atop Mount Tabor, the awakening of Gautama Buddha beneath the Bodhi tree, or the appearance of Gabriel to the prophet Muhammad in the cave on Mount Hira. The association was not lost on William James, who notes in the varieties of religious experience, quote, certain aspects of nature seem to have a peculiar power of awakening such mystical moods. Most of the striking cases which I have collected have occurred out of doors. End quote. Indeed, James was speaking from personal experience rather than the critical distance he puts on. A few years before he composed the lectures that would become varieties, James wrote a letter to his wife in which he describes an evening spent alone in the Adirondack Mountains after his companions had gone to bed. As the moon rose up over his cabin and choked out the light of all but the brightest stars, James writes, I got into a state of spiritual alertness of the most vital description. I spent a good deal of it in the woods, where the streaming moonlight lit up things in a magical checkered play, and it seemed as if the gods of all the nature mythologies were holding an indescribable meeting in my breast with the moral gods of the inner life. The intense significance of some sort of the whole scene, if one could only tell the significance, the intense inhuman remoteness of its inner life, and yet the intense appeal of it. In the same letter, James refers to this evening as his Adirondack Walpurgis-Nacht, and suggests that the experience set him, quote, quite a hitch ahead on the Giffords lectures that would later become the varieties of religious experience. The book that established the study of mysticism then, and set the pace for much of religious studies in the 20th century, was dreamed up by William James one night alone in the mountains when moral gods and nature spirits provoked an intense inhuman feeling in his breast. A few years later, in a work that was influenced in no small part by James' varieties, the German theologian Rudolph Otto put forward a phenomenological study of religious experience in his 1917 book, The Idea of the Holy. Central to Otto's study was his idea of the Numinous, a kind of phenomenological core of religious experience itself. The Numinous is a feeling. Otto describes the Numinous as a feeling or awareness provoked by a presence in the environment. He uses the term creature feeling, reinforcing the place of this feeling in the body. It is a creature feeling because it gives one a sense of one's own organism, naked and vulnerable as it is before an overwhelming presence. This is a tricky point that Otto is making, which is important for our subject here today. Revelations of the world take place within the body of the subject of revelation, but they always seem to refer to or be provoked by something else, something in the environment, as Otto calls it, something wholly other. And it is not just other in the sense that I might be a stranger to you, or a cat is a different sort of stranger to us both. It is perhaps infinitely other. It has an otherness that can be neither expressed nor permanently bridged. The mysterium tremendum of the numinous is the creature feeling of the presence of the wholly other. The historian of religions Mircea Eliade would go on to further refine Rudolph Otto's ideas into the comparative concept of the hierophany. At this point, the phenomenological approach of Otto has been built right into the word. A hierophany is definitionally an appearance, a manifestation. In Eliade's comparative analysis of revelation in the history of religions, hierophanies were always something that took place through or in some feature of the world. Otto's assertion that the numinous originated in the environment now finds more direct examples in Eliade's sweeping data of the history of religions. Eliade was fond of using the examples of a rock and a tree as sites of hierophany in order to remind his readers that religious experiences not only could, but often did occur through apparently mundane presences in the environment. In each case, the rock or the tree do not become holy because they are a rock or a tree. Rather, the sacred appears through the presence of the rock or the tree. The religious experience share of the sacred in a tree is still the same sacred in a new form. It is that same old mysterium tremendum in the key of tree. For James, through Eliade, the phenomenological core of many of the experiences that we call religious has been some kind of revelation or encounter with the world on non-human terms. The sacred may appear, as Eliade suggested, through wood or stone or water or sky. But what constitutes the experience as revelatory is not simply the appearance of such, but its manner of unveiling itself to the human before it. The hierophanies are stories of humans experiencing mountains and the key of mountains, in mountain space and on mountain time. As Otto shows us, the Holy Other is not a perfectly moral being, but neither is it evil. Rather, it appears to us like a Lovecraftian terror, monstrous in its indifference, mercifully with fewer tentacles or rolling eyes. Cthulhu in the form of a humble rock or a tree, staring back at us in its true form. In this next section, I will turn to a particular figure whose writings evoke the kind of experience that I'm trying to understand. Jakob Ouma, the 17th century German shoemaker, from whom so many currents of religious, philosophical, and aesthetic insight have emerged in the intervening centuries, was deeply preoccupied with his material environment and his place within it. In his writings, he shares that he felt his world so acutely and intensely that the years leading up to his major visionary period were marked by the overwhelming presence, oppressive presence of his environment. I fell finally into a great melancholy and sadness as I gazed upon the great depths of the world, along with the sun and the stars, the clouds, the rain and snow, and considered my spirit the whole of the creation of this world, wherein I found good and evil in all things, and love and anger in the unreasoning creatures as well as wood and stone, earth and the elements, and humans as well as animals. Contrary to the philosophical and religious trends of the day, in which harmony, reason, and machine-like order were the dominant existential forces of the cosmos, Ouma's world was profoundly disjointed. Stars, clouds, humans, and other animals seemed to just barely coexist in a great chaotic mess of good and evil. Even wood and stone seemed to ooze a soup of love and anger. The narrative of Ouma's subsequent visionary period is well known, even if the author left us little in the way of biographical details. Abraham von Frankenberg, a follower and biographer of Ouma, tells us that the revelatory episode that led to his exegetical text Aurora was catalyzed by Ouma happening to catch a ray of sunlight glancing off a pewter dish. Here I would like to focus on two components of Ouma's writings and their interpretations. First, the role of Welt or world in Ouma's thought, and second, the role of the body in Ouma's visions and exegetical writings. Ouma's approach to the world was informed by two major factors. First, his anxiety surrounding new astronomical measurements that seemed to indicate that the cosmos contained a vastness, truly alienating and unimaginable a la Pascal, and the medieval European notion of nature as a book. The idea of the book of nature, placed alongside the Bible as a compendium and demonstration of God's creation, was a popular notion that picked up a kind of esoteric traction as it was employed by authors that Ouma was familiar with, like Giordano Bruno and Paracelsus. As a tradesman, Ouma had neither the training nor the social standing to seriously engage with contemporary astronomers, scientists, or theologians, but he also disdained the possibility of simply denying or turning away from their knowledge. This contradictory intellectual impulse led him back to what he knew, a kind of folk cosmology of the book of nature, exegeted on his own terms. Ouma's particular spin on this notion was that the world as a book was not meant to be read as text, rather it was meant to be felt or experienced. Indeed, Ouma takes this world as book image to an experiential extreme when he declares, "I do not carry in my knowledge letters from many books, rather I have the letters within me. The whole of heaven and earth, as well as God himself, lies within man. Should he then not read the book that he himself is? When I read myself, I read in God's book." How did Ouma reach this startling position, in which he seems to argue that he carries the world itself within him? As Joshua Gensky argues, Ouma's cosmology was deeply informed by a knowledge of the body as the location in which the boundary between self and world deteriorates. As Gensky demonstrates, Ouma's exegesis points towards a new heaven and a new location of divine reality and one's own experience of oneself as an organism. The true heaven, which is our own human heaven, has until now been all but hidden from the children of men, Ouma writes. Gensky interprets this passage as follows, quote, "Heaven, understood in its true sense, is neither a metaphysical abstraction nor a domain fixed in space and time. It is a mode of being, an experience inseparable from the human organism itself." End quote. Ouma has remapped the troubled world that he inherited and replaced it with a divine cosmos in his own body, and the revelations of Ouma were a kind of embodied cognition of his own organism and its home in the world. This was accomplished by simply changing the nature of the book, in particular the book of nature. Ouma's book could not be read with words but only felt with hands, eyes, tongue, wings, or antennae. Gensky's translation of a particular passage from Aurora shows how strongly this sense of organic, creaturely becoming permeated Ouma's cosmology. "And even if this heaven is bound to your heaven as one body, and is also a body of God, and you have not become a creature in this location, which is over many thousand miles away, rather, you have become a creature in this world, which also has a depth within it that no human number can measure. Therefore the true heaven is all around, in the very place where you stand and from which you depart." Ouma's revelation of the world in his own body helps us understand the meaning of Otto's creature feeling of the Numinous. For Ouma, it was the oppressive presence of his environment, finally catalyzed in a beam of light which provoked an apocalypse or revelation within his own body. This revelation of the world takes place within the body, always with reference to something in the environment. This might seem paradoxical or contradictory, and this is what makes the revelation so significant for the experiencer. The boundary between self and world is real, but it is porous, and the body represents the crossroads in which these moments of blurring take place. One name for the kind of experiences that we have been discussing thus far is nature mysticism. I have tried to steer clear of such terminology for a few reasons. First, the word nature has two common uses, neither of which I feel are particularly useful here. First, in a scientific sense, nature refers to everything, or more specifically, to a hypothesized dynamic and creative regulatory principle that structures the entirety of the phenomenal cosmos. Second, in a more romantic sense, nature refers to the aesthetic and religious meaning, pleasure, and knowledge that humans derive from the presence of non-humans, like Coleridge in the Lake District, Whitman looking up at the stars, or David Attenborough peeking at the camera while pointing at a pair of tropical birds. In both cases, this category has the tendency to split human beings from everything else, or in a more Cartesian sense, to at least divorce cognitive processes from their embodied context. As scholars like Bruno Latour, Timothy Morton, and Val Plumwood have argued, the word nature itself also encodes a dense array of political meanings that set up false and potentially disastrous distinctions among humans, other animals, and their environments, in addition to encoding a plethora of hierarchical structures along gender, race, and class. The term mysticism is one that I have avoided less strictly but still employ with reluctance, simply for the deeply contested nature of scholarship on the subject. To delineate an experience as mystical is to project generations of debates between Catholics and Protestants, between scholars of religion, and of course to raise the eyebrows of cognitive scientists who are eager to pathologize such narratives and such people. To be clear, I do not dismiss mystics, mysticism, or the experience of such. Rather, I reject nature mysticism simply because I reject nature, and I avoid mysticism because I am conflict averse. A more general, and I think helpful category of analysis for what we are talking about here today is the category of the paranormal as defined by Jeffrey Kripal. In his book, Secret Body, Kripal puts forward the following definition of paranormal experiences. Quote, the experience collapse of the mind-matter split via the eruption of events in the physical world that uncannily correspond to the subjective or unconscious states of a focal agent. End quote. For Kripal, the paranormal is an event consisting of a kind of phenomenological correspondence between the inner subjective state of a human being and something else that they perceive in their physical environment. This correspondence is uncanny not only because it undermines prevailing physicalist notions of reality, but because it undermines the notion of a rigidly defined subject. Kripal defines the paranormal as a moment of phenomenological correspondence between self and world. With this perspective in mind, and by way of concluding, I would like to turn to this idea of self-world correspondence as it has appeared in the history of phenomenology. In Merleau-Ponty's work, he sees an intractable problem with the philosophy of his time. Husserl claims the things are all in us, Heidegger declares them all in themselves. To which Merleau-Ponty replies, it is time for, quote, a revision of our ontology, for the re-examination of the notions of subject and object. Merleau-Ponty would argue that such a dualism breaks down in the body. He calls this correspondence the chiasm, roughly the intersection. Just as they were for Ouma, self and world remain sturdy conceptual categories for Merleau-Ponty. And as they do in Ouma's writings, they intersect and overlap here in the flesh of the body. Merleau-Ponty's famous example is the simple possibility of touching, for just as one can reach out and touch another, that connection implies that one might touch you back. As Merleau-Ponty puts it, quote, between my body touched and my body touching, there is overlapping or encroachment, so that we may say that the things pass into us, as well as we into the things. This intersection or chiasm describes how the self and world, while remaining divergent, can simultaneously share or know certain components of each other. The uncanny or paranormal potentials of this correspondence or crossroads in the body that have been noted by Jeffrey Kripal were not lost on Merleau-Ponty, who betrays his own suspicion that the Cartesian severing of self and world may be responsible for nothing less than the evacuation of magic from the world through a historical process commonly called disenchantment. To be sure, he writes, we have repressed the magical into the subjectivity, but there is no guarantee that the relationship between men does not inevitably involve magical and oniric components. This intersubjective world of the human was also of interest to Derrida, whose book, The Animal That Therefore I Am, relates the author's experience of getting out of the shower and feeling something like shame when he makes eye contact with his cat. Thank you. There is something in the gaze and presence of the cat for Derrida that is irretrievably other, unbridgeably vast, but undeniably present, that compels a sort of fascination and terror. Oh, we've gone to bed. Oh, well. All right. So this is a Derrida quote. Seeing oneself naked under a gaze that is vacant to the extent of being bottomless, at the same time innocent and cruel perhaps sensitive and impassive, good and bad, uninterpretable, unreadable, undecidable, abyssal and secret, wholly other, like the every bit other that is every bit other found in such intolerable proximity that I do not as yet feel justified or qualified to call it my fellow, even less my brother. End quote. There is a yawning gulf between Derrida and cat that has no limits. In this infinite space, Derrida writes, he is a child ready for the apocalypse. Or more precisely, he is suddenly aware of his naked body in this world and ready for the unveiling, the revelation, the disclosure or apocalypse of the world that has been the subject of this paper. Naked before the eyes of his cat, Derrida recognizes that the human is the animal who is compelled to cover its nakedness, to mediate its relationship to its environment with clothing, with physical dwelling to live in, and with complex cultural and intersubjective dwellings to think in. And then a cat comes along, or perhaps a rock suddenly reveals itself, or you catch a glance of light from a pewter dish, and it all blows away for a moment. There is just a naked body among bodies whose being is wholly other in the now shared terminology of Rudolph Otto and Jacques Derrida. The religion of the world that Francis Yates finds in the Hermetic literature can be found throughout the history of religions in moments that I have called revelations of the world. As I conclude, I want to be clear that my focus on a worldly and embodied approach to such experiences is in no way meant to rob them of their deep mystery and profound significance, nor to claim a definitive understanding of the subject. The unveiling rarely signals itself, and predictions of apocalypse are infallibly false. I have simply presented a new reading, attempting to tie together little strands of the history of religions, Jakob Ouma, and some French philosophers, to herald a whole array of little apocalypses to be found in our own bodies, in our shared worlds, and in the eyes of our cats. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, I should have said, although we started late, I don't think it's really fair to penalise our speakers. This might mean you end up getting your lunch a little bit late, but do we have any questions? Yeah.
So, Tim, I giggled when you said you were conflict averse, and you were going to use the word paranormal instead of mysticism. Do you have any thoughts about that? I mean, it's not conflict averse, right?
No, sure. Yeah. Well, I think the word, so it's just a different sort of conflict you're courting.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I think I'm much more comfortable courting the conflict over the term paranormal just because that's a conversation that I'm familiar with, and I tend to know what someone else is going to say, whereas mysticism, and again, it's not, in no way was my paper kind of a polemical against mysticism. I just sort of wanted to mention why I didn't use that phrase.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I think nature mysticism is a perfectly fine way to do it, but I just wanted to point out just particular problems I have with the word nature, and then I don't really have problems with the word mysticism, but obviously it's easy to trip over.
It's interesting too that the two things you have problems with are nouns.
Yeah.
And the thing you like is an adjective.
Yeah.
I think that's interesting.
Yeah. Sure. Thanks, Jeff.
I have a question. So I'm really interested in your reading, and as well as the quote you showed from Ouma, talking about the way in which the body itself is kind of a reading device for the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And that's such a kind of extended idea of significance or of the possibility of meaning existing in some way outside of the kind of discursive or linguistic realm.
Yeah,
and yet
absolutely.
it's still the metaphor of the book.
Absolutely.
And so, would you say more about Ouma in that, or? I
mean, I think, I do not make any sort of claim to understand Jakob Ouma in any kind of meaningful way, as I don't know if anybody could, but, I wonder what word he would have used if he had a vocabulary that we have now, because obviously he wants to express something that a book is the closest thing he can get to, but he doesn't, there's no other, metaphor for vast information archive or whatever that he can access. But also I think that, when he describes the analogous location of your soul's place in heaven, which he says is thousands of miles away, and the heaven in this earth, there's still kind of an analogy between the stuff of the body and the stuff of the world, and that the knowledge of the stuff of the world can be accessed via the knowledge of the stuff of the body, which is much closer to what you have access to. So yeah, I would love to know, if we could talk to him today, what kind of word he would use about that.
Yeah.
I understand you're problematizing the word natural. Do you think that there's an importance, or that it's important to make a difference or a distinction between, say, being in an old-growth forest or being in an urban environment, and how you would define either place if you don't want to say that one place is natural?
Yeah, I think, what's the word I'm looking for? So I guess, when we talk about an old-growth forest versus an urban space. And I think we could comfortably use the word nature as defined to describe either one. I think the difference that we're really looking at is kind of both social structure and also like resilience. So an old-growth forest will basically take care of itself indefinitely, barring some like brand new invasive species like Japanese bark beetles or Homo sapiens. An old-growth forest can basically take care of itself, whereas an urban environment is just kind of paper that might start blowing away very, very quickly. So those are kind of the two major distinctions I see between those sorts of places: social structure and kind of resilience or durability.
Then how would one facilitate revelation of the other?
How can you say a little more?
So is resilience important in facilitating revelation?
My guess is, and I don't know, my guess is a temporary kind of yielding of sort of like intersubjective structure, just meaning like culture, like a temporary just kind of quieting of like that social part of the mind probably has something to do with it. And kind of like entering that more like anti-structural or liminal zone, Victor Turner. I think that seems to work. It seems like every traditional culture in the world, except for us, has developed some sort of system to kind of catalyze these experiences in kids to make them adults, and usually that involves some kind of wild or unstructured setting. But I don't know. I really don't know.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
And